He's so incredible.
All right, are we ready, gentlemen? Welcome back. How was the little break there? Nice? Got refueled?
Yeah, hang on.
You never break?
Just a second.
Sunday?
Sunday.
Felt like a normal Sunday.
For you. Yankees.
Yo.
Okay, listen, Americans, they have a lot to learn. When you get a Sunday off, it's a vacation. Okay. Ready to go, Pinchas?
Yep.
You going over here?
Yeah, it's,
Okay,
give Josh a seat.
gotcha.
That's a good question from that seat. I love the kid.
You ready to go? We're live? We're live. Okay. So let's do a quick recap because it's been a hot minute since we sat together. Just bring us back moments to the title over here. We're learning a Yud-based Tammuz mimer from 1964, Tafshin Chaf Dalid. The reason we, thank you, Mr. Pech. That's good. The reason we sort of launched into this was because in our previous mimer, which was Bar Mitzvah mimer, also shaykh to Yud-based Tammuz, we stumbled into this concept that Sof Maisav Machshava Techila, if you recall. What's last indeed is first in thought. And what was the sort of chiddush that we said regarding that? If you remember, we said not just first in thought, but first before thought. This was the whole mimer that we learned based on that, if you remember. So upon that, we basically wanted to follow up that theme. And so there's a whole mimer here which discusses this theme in depth. We began the mimer, and I believe we even had 2 classes on it. One of them didn't make the movies, because we missed our David somehow for that one. But there was just a handful of people there. So I'm going to do a quick review of the first class and the second class. First of all, the mimer is called Hasam Nafshenu B'chaim V'lo Nasan Lamot Ragleinu. He placed our souls in life, and he didn't let our feet stumble. If you recall, we had a whole conversation about what does it mean to place our souls in life. There is a little difficulty with this because we said, even though there's 2 aspects of the soul, right? There's the aspect of the soul that goes into the body and therefore gets delineated between different aspects of your kelim. In other words, your head can handle more life, let's say, than your heart, which can handle more life than your feet. So there's a distribution of powers of life that go into the body. And it's true that that's sometimes called the soul, for sure. But then there's something called the soul itself, which is what's called chai be'etzem, like life itself. And we said there's a different aspect of the life of the soul. We compared it to the difference between mamale and sovev, if you recall. Right? Just like Hashem has sort of 2 different aspects of life that fill the world. One is a mamale light, which distributes itself in accordance with whatever keli is being filled at that time, whether it's man, animal, plant, or inanimate. Right? This is called the mamale life. But then there's like an underlying life called the sovev, which is equal in all of them. It's just the energizing force of all things before you can actually even delineate it into its parts. So the soul also has this. And this is called chai be'etzem, just the fact that it's alive, before you start breaking down the life that it could be like this or like this, that's equal in all the different aspects of your body, right? Your foot is not any less alive than your brain is alive, right? Even we said the bottom of the foot, which is the heel, which is called the malach hamaves in the body, it's like the angel of death in the body, is still alive, right? It's still attached to your, and it has a certain aspect of essential life in it. So what was our question? Who remembers? We said if you want to say Hasam Nashenu B'chaim, if you were going to be saying that you're going to give our soul life, right? He puts life into our soul. If you were speaking about one of the more, delineated miniature versions of life that maybe is in the foot or that's in the heart, then I could say that you're going to give it more life because you can up its level. But since the Frierdiker Rebbe explained that the life that's being referred to here is already the etzem achayis, right? It's the soul which is chay be'etzem. Then we said sam nafshenu b'chayim doesn't make any sense. It means you're gonna give more life to something which is essentially alive. Yeah. Oh. We said the soul is so essentially alive that anything it touches automatically becomes alive. That its revelation that comes off of it is equally as alive as it, because that's the notion of any revelation that comes from an etzem. The revelation is always in line, in comparison to the etzem. So since the etzem that we're talking about is essential life, any revelation automatically gives life. So even in association with this level of the soul automatically brings the entire body to life. And that's why he said, Hasam nafshenu b'chaim, that it was our nafshenu was a plural, referring to both the godly soul and the animal soul, because when the godly soul touches the animal soul, it also becomes essentially alive. And how is it shy to put more life into something which is essentially alive? So, who remembers the answer? Aha. Right, that's why I'm doing a review. It's been a while since we learned this. The answer was, Hashem is going to do the impossible, right? There's going to somehow be, he's introducing a level of life which is somehow higher than what we call something which is essentially life, chai be'etzem, and this is going to somehow enter into the situation that the Frierdiker Rebbe is essentially saying, upon statement of this Maimer, whatever happened with the miracle of his day of liberation, that Hasam nafshenu b'chaim, Hashem was even able to put into something which is essentially alive, another level of chayis, which is even in some capacity greater than life be'etzem. And we're going to have to find out exactly what that means. But it's just introducing a new level. And the point that he made was that somehow the introduction of this new level, which is higher than essential life, we have to now re-understand the second part of this verse, which is V'lo nasan lamot ragleinu. He didn't let our foot falter. Seemingly, these two things are as opposite as they could be, because the foot is already in the other category of life, which can be distributed into parts, and it's the lowest part of that category. And yet, somehow, when you add this super new level of life, which is beyond the essence of life, it is an association with not letting your foot falter. And we said these two things seem so opposite. How do they connect? That was the question of chapter 1. Does everyone feel refreshed on chapter 1? David, you remember any of this? Well, you were there, man. You filmed the whole thing and everything. L'chaim. See, this is why Americans are not as advanced, because they have Sunday off and they forget what happened the whole last week and the week before. Okay, so then we went on to chapter 2. Chapter 2, you have a copy, Josh? No. Is there any extra ones we can pass along? Chapter 2, we started to explain this topic, which is the reason why we jumped into this mimer in the first place. Sof masav machshavat achila. And what we wound up saying, this notion of what's last indeed is first in thought, and we explained this in the sense that we actually learned it from a diuk of the Lashon, right? Because it says machshava techila, the actual language is machshava techila and not techilas hamachshava. What's the difference between those two phrases? Sof masev machshava techila, or you could say but techilas hamachshava. Yeah.
Before fault and first.
What's that?
Before fault and first.
Right. Techilas hamachshava literally means the beginning of thought, right? But it doesn't say that in the beginning of thought in this phrase. It says machshava techila, which basically means it was in thought but before. So it refers to this idea of going before thought. And then we had a question on this, because there's another principle which this seems to bump up against, which we explain. There's another concept called na'ut techilasan besofim b'techilasan. You remember this concept? The beginning is wedged in the end, and the end is wedged in the beginning. Let me just see if I can find it inside.
Like the wedding feast?
What's that?
Like the wedding feast?
The wedding feast?
That we're talking about, or like the man only gets happy after everybody already ate?
So this is how we explained it in the previous mimer, right? So that's why I wanted to dig into it. Yeah, that was one of the examples to explain how there's such a thing that you can go. But in principle, hang on a second. We said that it seems to defy a general rule of nature and a rule of essentially science, right? Yeah, he brings this at the end of the paragraph. But essentially, the whole idea of this paragraph is summarized by the last line, where he says, "Na'utz techilasa b'sofa b'techilasa." There's a phrase from the Sefer Yetzirah, which says that Hashem wedged the beginning into the end and the end into the beginning. And we said that seems to be the rule, that when something is created, right, in machshava, and then it comes out into deed, the principle is that you can only ever reach back up to the origin of this deed. So we wound up explaining it in kind of a highfalutin way, where the first thing that Hashem did, for example, in creation, was it went up in His will to create all the worlds. And that sort of, where it went up into His will, was inside of the Orein Sof. Hashem sort of had this ratzon, this thought, where He's going to now create all the worlds. We said this was like a little, you can imagine this as like a little drop in the ocean, right? From this drop in the ocean, Hashem then creates all the worlds out of this. We went through actually an interesting new categorical understanding of what Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, and Asiya were, if you remember last time. We introduced a new topic of how to define the placement of the worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, and Asiya. Does anyone remember that conversation, first of all? I see Dan is shaking his head yes. What is Atzilus B'klalus?
Well, the general Atzilus, because there are 4 placeholder worlds for the infinite worlds that exist. So the original Atzilus is that drop of water in the ocean before the Tzimtzum. So Atzilus is the drop of water in the ocean, Atzilus the clouds. Then Tzimtzum, then Adam Kadma, the primordial man, because it has 10 Sifri roads. So the Tzimtzum removes all the water, all the ocean, then Bria the clouds, the first thing that happens after Tzimtzum. Then the space.
What world is that called? The Bria de Klalus. What's another name for that world?
Someone else answer that.
Yes.
Adam
Adam Kadmon.
What's the translation for that?
Right? So Adam Kadmon is the first world after the Tzimtzum, and that's called Bria, de Klalus, right? We're like changing our variables here. What comes after Bria of Klalus? Yeah. And what happens next?
And then I wrote that lights are all in one vessel because the light comes after the 10 Sifri road, the potential are in there. So now to get to the individual Sifri road to come out and be seen, for that to happen is a violent reaction.
Okay.
Because all the individual parts do not know how to come out yet, so they break, the light breaks. And that's Yetzirah de Klaus.
Good. And what's another name for that world? Tohu, right? That's tohu. Basically means like when the lights try to express, exactly as you said, when they try to express themselves from that original world, they don't have the proper kelim to experience such a high level of light, and there's a whole section of continuum before those lights actually settle into what's called Asiya B'klalus. And what's another name for Asiya B'klalus? Atzilus. Go back to the beginning, right? In other words, what we normally call Atzilus is actually the Asiya of a different scale, right? So it goes, again, Atzilus is before the Tzimtzum, the will in Hashem's mind to create everything. Then Adam Kadmon, which is the first world after the Tzimtzum. Then a sort of interim area, which we're going to call Yetzirah of Klalus, or Tohu, sometimes it's described, or Nekudim. And then you get to finally putting those lights in their vessels, which becomes Asiya, the Klalus, but now we can start to talk about Atzilus of the worlds that we're normally aware of. So Atzilus, Bria, Tzir, and Asiya then follow in the worlds once you get to Atzilus in this final version, then the idea is you're already working with godly lights in vessels. The next thing we're going to do is now step away from that and make a Bria, which is essentially now it looks like you have vessels which are not godly. This is the beginning of what's actually called creation. Whereas you can understand why we would call Adam Kadmon creation to a certain degree, because at least it was a separation from the infinite light and was the first world, but that world was entirely infinite and divine, so it's not really the Bria yet. It's a larger version of the Bria.
Is there practical sparks in this world from the world of Torah?
Every single thing that you see is a practical spark from the world of Tohu. There's nothing. That's what matter is. It's spark. It's the leftovers from tohu. So the fact that it's alive is because it has some version of enlivening life inside of it, which is a fallout from tohu. If you would take the world from tohu and then reconstruct it into some kind of a mitzvah, right? You take and you make a blessing over it, then you're basically converting that tohu energy and fixing it and making it into tikkun, right? Metakein olam. But everything that there is essentially tohu sparks. Now, why do we get into all that? Right? It was an interesting conversation, but really the reason why we got into it as far as the mind was concerned is because even after you get all the way down to Asiya, the one we know about, right? And you want to then pick up the Sof Maisa, where can it go? Something can only go back to its source. And if you want to say it can go back to Atzilus, or if you want to go say it goes back to Atzilus B'Klalus, that it can find its way all the way back to the origin in the mind of God, where it had this original will before the Tzimtzum, fine. But before that, how you get that's its origin. How's it going to suddenly go back to a place from before it started? And this is the question. What did we mean when we say Sof Ma'asev Machshava Techila, that it can go back to a place before its origin? That goes against seemingly another principle that's in place, which is Na'ut Techilasan B'Sof and B'Sof B'Techilasan. Avram Avinu wrote that. It's not a dummy, right? He already prefaced this and said, wait a second. The end is wedged the beginning is wedged the end, which has awesome ramifications in its own right. It means that you can actually unearth the beginning in the end, which means I can tap into the Ora Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum right here, because at some level the end is wedged in the beginning and vice versa. But before the beginning, it sort of doesn't. It goes against the principle. Remember we said this sort of idea with the measure. What do you call it? The
water level.
Yeah, what do you call that thing? A level, right? So you take a hose basically, and you bend the two sides facing up. And you put some water in. Wherever the water is on one side, it's going to be exactly the same on the other side. You can't have a situation where the beginning, right, the end goes higher than the beginning. It's only going to always ever level out to where its origin is, and it can't go higher than that. So what do we mean that there's this idea of going Sof Masa before the Machshava? That the end indeed precedes all that. Yeah, do you have a question?
Why are we talking about this? I was just confused how this connects to the soul thing, like where it gives more life.
Oh, that's a good question. So he first of all, I mean, I guess I'll give it away. Since you're being blunt, I'll be blunt. But the idea is that he talks about this idea of when you reach this level of the soul, which is above the essential soul, right, we discussed a moment ago, it connects to your foot shouldn't falter, right? So he's trying to explain why the foot is associated with this level of life force, which is beyond the essential life force. Which, if you could put the pieces together, it's pretty much exactly what we're saying in the next paragraph, where he starts to describe the idea of Sof Ma'asev Machshava Techila, right? He's talking about Sof Ma'asev, the foot, how suddenly it gets you to before the original thought. He's basically saying that's what this pasuk is about. Why Dafka, the foot, doesn't falter is associated with this level which is beyond the essential life of the soul. He's introducing something new. There's a level of life force which is beyond Chai Be'etzem. And how do you get to that? From the foot not faltering. So you see, from the Sof Maisa, you can get to something before the Machshava Techila. Now, he doesn't really say all that. You understand what I just said?
Yeah.
Okay. But you have to take some ownership on that yourself. Did anyone else understand what I just said? Yeah? Everybody? Yeah? It's pretty straightforward. In other words, this next paragraph is a direct answer to the first paragraph. It's just, if I didn't sort of spell it out for you, or even if I did, you probably wouldn't pick it up right away. But okay, once again, ready, Yoshua?
Yeah.
For the back seats in the, what do you call it? The bleachers. Okay, so here it is, right? I mean, again, this is more than I'm supposed to tell you, but since inquiring minds want to know. So the idea is like this. What do we say in the first paragraph? We introduced a level of life force which is really beyond the beginning. Because we said the soul, the essential life of the soul is as high as it gets. And now we're introducing something which is going to give life to that. We don't even know what that is yet. right? But then we said the end of that verse talks about lo nasan lamot raglenu. He doesn't let our foot falter. So when we asked the question, what is this essential new level of life force, which we never heard of before, have to do specifically with the life force in the foot? Where'd you get the foot from? Like we're introducing new levels of life. Fine. So what do we see? This is very much exactly the conversation we just had. Sof maisa, the foot, reaches before the machshava, right? It goes to some level which is beyond the beginning. Right? It's pretty much exactly what we're saying in the first paragraph.
So
He's just trying to explain it in different osios.
But where did this come from that the Sof Maisa reaches before the beginning?
Well, first of all, there's just a phrase that we say every Shabbos, right? Sof ma'aseh machshava techila. So just like that's a standalone phrase. What's last indeed is first in thought. There's a reading of the Baal Shem Tov, which because it doesn't say techila sa machshava, but machshava techila, right? We learn from there, it's not saying that what's last indeed is in thought first, but rather it precedes thought. That's how we learned it. That's how we learned it in the last mimer, and we spent a week or two wondering about it. That's why we brought this mimer to begin with, because it dives into this very concept. Right? So we have this issue. Baal Shem Tov, what do you mean when you say what's last indeed even precedes the first thought, right? When there's another principle on the table from Avram Avinu that the end is wedged in the beginning, not before the beginning, and the beginning is wedged in the end, not before the beginning, right? So, but now we're starting to see why he's bringing this, because it's a continuation of what he said in the first paragraph, that somehow when your foot doesn't falter, you get to the sof, you can get to some new level,
So that's
right?
why you're talking about the hose, because you're
That's
saying
why we're talking about the
that
hose, man.
Last part can't be higher than the first part.
Exactly, seemingly, but and yet we have this evidence of two different places, the first chapter of this mimer, and this reading of the Baal Shem Tov, so machshava techila, which seems to defy this rule of Avram Avinu that you can only get back to the beginning. You can't get back to before the beginning. Yes. Question?
Was there ever a time, obviously it's above time, but above time where there was no drop in the Ein Sof about the potential of the world before Hashem ever thought?
Yeah. Yes.
Or just Ein Sof and nothing else?
Yeah. But the point is that the origin of the will for the world starts with the drop. So therefore, when it finally reaches to its ultimate potential, it can only reach back to where it started, right? Seemingly, yeah.
Was the origin of the world not even further than this? Just God's essence is that the world is to be created, and this is even before the will. Was that?
When you say God's essence, this has to be created. As long as it's a will, it's already like some kind of an addition or emergence of something that wasn't there before, right? So no, there is an idea where ein od milvado, right? And there's such a thing as before Hashem created the world, right? It was just Him and His name alone. There was some kind of a discussion of God, obviously, before the world. The world is sort of peanuts, right? It's no big deal. It's just one tiny ray of light. So, okay, we're going to see, maybe Chassidus finds some evidence of the world even in a deeper place, but that's already, you have to really dig into understand as to why that would be. Everybody on board? That was the recap. Okay, let's go into Oz Gimel, if you have your mimer there. Let's do a deeper dive into this statement from the Sefer Yetzirah, written by our father Avraham, where it says that the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end is wedged in the beginning. And what we're saying is, we're doubling down, this is just a connection with the end to the beginning, not above the beginning. To understand this, let's look, for example, about the influence of chesed and goodness from the standpoint of the ratzon, right? You have a will to give chesed and goodness, lashpia la'ani, and you want to give over to a poor person, the leisle migar meklum. And the idea of the poor person is called someone leisle, he doesn't have migar from himself anything. So this is the idea of a poor person. This is called healthy tzedakah. You're going to give the person who has really a need. You have a will to give chesed to the poor. Which means, he's going to take us through this process that he just described. The beginning, right, the beginning of thought, techilas hamachshava. Nis'ore barachmim pshutim ala'ani. he winds up getting aroused with a simple mercy for this poor person. The first thing that sort of enters into his screen is this overwhelming mercy for the poor person. Because he is hit with this feeling of mercy, the mercy produces a will to give chesed. Right? In other words, like the origin of the feeling is I want to have mercy. I see a person with nothing, right? I'm just feeling rachamim on this person. But then the mercy itself is it produces suddenly a will, right? Now that I have mercy, I want something from this situation. I want to give chesed. And what happens is the mercy becomes what's called a reason or a taste, because it's interesting that the word taste and reason is the same in Hebrew, and a pleasure for this ratzon. In other words, the seder of hishtalshelus from inside of Keser, right? Keser has two parts, we usually say. What are the two parts of Keser?
Higher will and pleasure.
So from below to above, right? You're going? So it starts with pleasure and then will. Yes?
Yeah.
So there's the higher part of Keser. What do we call that in fancy language? Atik Yomin, right? It's the inner dimension of Keser. And what's the lower part of Keser? Erech Anpin. Put those words in your head there. And then what we describe them as is pleasure and will. Because this is sort of the origin of the soul. The soul originates in this idea of having some intrinsic pleasure, and the pleasure creates a will. So what do we say from there? That the pleasure is sort of the reason for the will. But because it's going to bring you some kind of a pleasure, therefore this will is produced because the will is the way that you access that pleasure. So it becomes what's called a tam and oneg for that will. Pleasure for the will, or a reason behind the will. Once you've now been aroused with this will, which was itself aroused from a pleasure to do good with this poor person, the ratzon now goes down another notch and produces basically brains. It produces sort of intelligent way of effectively giving that goodness to him, right? Because you have to use intelligence in order to bring out the plan and mastermind this actual giving that's going to come to the poor person, right? So you have this intrinsic pleasure from it. It produces a will. The will then cloaks itself into some kind of a rational platform of how I'm going to accomplish this. Once the intellect has gotten hold of this will and made it an intellectual concept, the intellect then gives birth to emotions. Right? Because that's what the intellect is called, the father and the mother. The chokhmah and the bina are called the father and the mother that give birth to emotions. Suddenly you're having a feeling of love, right, towards this person based on your intellect, which has produced this love. Then what happens next? It now goes from the heart back to the mind. But why does it go back to the mind? Because it's going to now into the levush, the garment of machshava, right? In other words, just because you have this emotion now you have to produce letters of thought which are going to ultimately shape this emotion and give it, an actual, I guess what you call it, words that describe this emotion, which are words of thought. And then, laharher bazen, you're going to think about it, as explained in Tanya. What comes after the thought? I'm going to go through this whole thing again. What comes after the thought? You produce letters out of your emotions called thought letters. Those letters are then poised to create actual letters of speech. To the point that those speech actually says, okay, give him the tzedakah, and actually it results in the giving of the tzedakah to the poor person. And that's called sof maiseh. That's called the last indeed. So let's just go through that again. What did we just go through, basically, is the more or less dissension of how any decision gets made in your lives at every turn. You don't usually think about the whole process, right? It goes from the keser to the external part of the keser, to the chokhmah bina and das, to the midos, to the machshava, to the dibur, and to the maisa. This is a process that goes on every time we want to do anything, essentially. You follow the process down? One more time. It starts with what we're calling like an essential pleasure of the soul, which we're calling in this case like the feeling of rachmanis, right? That you just like, there's something intrinsic about us, deep inside of our soul, that has like this merciful feeling and wants to see mercy done to someone who lacks. So then, because of this essential feeling in the soul, it produces a will to enact this case of mercy being actually fulfilled. But it's still pretty far away from the actual hand that's going to give the tzedakah. This will has to then become like an intellectually understood by this part of the soul that's in your brain to sort of come up with a reasonable understanding of what this will is, right? The will produces the intellect. The intellect then gives birth to emotion. The emotion then gives birth to letters of thought, speech, and ultimately action. Does everyone understand this process? Have any questions on this?
So,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
I was going to say, you talked about thought letters.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about that in, I was reading Prince of Prison.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a couple times. I've never heard the phrase before. Is that just like the point where the will turns into like a thought that you can, like it becomes like hoppable? Like it's actually, like what exactly does it mean to turn something into thought letters?
Right. So first of all, I think what he mentions, like over there, thought letters, and he has like the little 3 dots after that.
Yeah.
That's a little bit different what he's saying there. But in general, when you have an emotion, and I'll explain this. I want to explain a little bit the difference between machshava and seichel, because if you notice, he said it goes from pleasure to will to the mind to the heart, and then back up to the mind. Did you notice that?
Right, so it's almost like...
So I want to explain why that is. When it's going to the mind the first time and then the mind the second time, they're not the same thing. It's a completely different thing that in English are just both called mind or thought. But it's the difference between what we call seichel and machshava. Seichel, intelligence, versus machshava. What's the difference between them? So let me explain. But first I'm going to explain by way of analogy through the midos. When a person is having an emotional experience, you may have had such an experience that's so emotional that you actually can't talk, right? Something happens to you, it's either happy or sad, that it grips you to the point that you are unable to express yourself. Until a little bit of time goes by, you kind of calm down, and then you can find the words for this experience, right? So what do you see from there? The emotion is not in and of itself a linguistic or verbal experience. There's no letters involved at the pure state of emotion, right? It's an emotion. If you want letters to be associated, now what we believe is that there's this interesting fusion between what we call light and vessel. Let's say the light is like the energy of the emotion in this case, and the letters are the vessels which you will eventually be able to put that emotion into. So for example, when I calm down and I can explain my emotion, it's because the light kind of diminished and the letters were able to become firm and take like a proper shape so that the light now sits inside of these letters, which means I can read that emotion. At least in my own brain, I have verbal, expression of an emotion, which is kind of an amazing thing, that I can express an emotion through letters, which are really something totally other than and like an independent vessel than the emotion itself. So that's what we call thought, speech, and action, the garments. Because to compare to the soul, they're mamish like another body, like a piece of clothing that you put on, which, okay, it's amazing that the clothes can make the man. Right? You can put some foreign substance upon yourself, and it somehow will bring across, here's a chassid, here's a fireman, right? Here's a father, here's a policeman. You can see from the clothes that the clothes in some weak way are actually expressing what this person is. So too in your own mind, the emotion has to calm down tremendously to contract itself in order to fit into these finite letters of thought. Once the letters are letters of thought, it's not that far of a process to transfer the letters of thought into letters of speech. Once you've already made the emotion small enough to fit into letters, you can make it a little bit smaller and it can fit into speech. So they say it takes like I don't know, an extra hour to say what you may have thought about in 20 minutes because there's a greater contraction when you put the letters even into speech, right? But the idea is that the emotion is pre-verbal, right? It's the letters are hiding inside of there in a way where they don't get to express themselves yet as letters. So take that up one notch, What precedes the emotion in the Sephardic tree?
The thought.
When you say thought there, you have to be very careful, because didn't we just say thought was the opposite? Thought is what emotion contracts itself into letters. Intellect. What's the difference between thought and intellect? This is the whole point of this speech.
Driven by emotion.
Thought is basically trying to, the letters containing the emotion. So what's intellect?
Intellect's a natural thing that exists there in its natural state. It's there.
Chokhmah.
So I'm trying to bring out an interesting point. I'm using emotions.
It's the same way that the thing that you just described earlier, the process it goes down from Chassidus and then goes back to Chassidus. That's the same thing that you're describing now, but within ourselves.
Right, true. So, I'm using emotion right now as a springboard to understand what intellect is. You clearly understand that you can have an emotional experience which precedes letters, right? Intellect is even higher than emotion, which means your true intellectual experience is not based on letters, right? It's like the way you perceive reality. It's the way that you sort of contrive an understanding of the things around you. It's a little bit harder to describe for some reason. I've always found it. But emotion, you can understand. Like I'm having an emotion that it's just emotional. It's not an experience that can be contained in letters. Intellect is even higher than emotion. It's Chokhmah, Bina, and Das preceding the 7 Midos. So for sure, the letters have not yet formed on that. Right? So there's this sort of underlying soul power. It's like, oh, he's got a good head. Like he thinks like his father. Doesn't mean he comes up with the same letters that his father comes up with. It means he perceives reality in a certain sense like his father. Right? There's the intellect, like you said, it's a natural process. Each one is built with a certain way of perceiving, just like a person has a leaning towards love or a leaning towards fear. Those emotions are not yet verbal or linguistic. Right? So now you can understand a little bit more what it means when it says that it goes from the pure pleasure of the mercy inside of the soul to then go into a will, to then it goes into this intellectual capacity. It's not yet like letters. It's basically like I'm now understanding this will that I'm going to make a conscious intellectual structure behind what it is that I want. Right? It makes sense to me, my will. Then that sense can come into emotion. That emotion can come into thought, speech, and action. That's the point.
That's where it's going from intellect down to the ability to back up, like the
Right.
boomerang thing.
Because it's not really going back to the intellect. It's going back to the thought.
Yeah.
Right? And the thought is not the intellect. It's just merely letters. Now, right. Right. Now, it is true, just as long as we're all good on this point, I will bring one more confusing point. It is possible to put thought letters directly on the intellect as well. In other words, you don't have to wait till your thought gets to be an emotion in order to wrap it into osios ha-machshava, letters of thought. That's like, for example, like a mimer might be, right? You could take pure intellect and wrap this into thought before necessarily dressing it up into an emotion, and then letting the emotion, which has the intellect sort of built inside of it, coming into letters. You follow what I'm saying, Yitzchak? Yeah? Yeah.
I think isn't that like where life experience just kind of it starts to shape this intellect. You know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
Like things that we perceive and we see going on around us, and it starts to shape it to the point to where like you can't dress it in a thought.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said. It's like the pathways of your mind are just going to, what's that?
Subconscious.
You could say it's subconscious. Even if you're conscious of it, it's still beyond letters. It could be, right? Although you might
Once it comes to consciousness, so that's when you start grasping, pulling.
Okay, so you might put into some machshava there. But I think there's even such a thing as conscious thought that's still beyond letters. Just like you're very much conscious of your emotions, even though they're so powerful you can't put them into letters. It's like you said, it's just like sort of why a person, based on his life experience or based on his genetics, why he'll be inclined to sort of perceive something a certain way. Literally, if a person grows up poor, or he grows up rich, or at least a poor mentality or a rich mentality, right? So he's going to actually like filter in the world around him based on this. So his will, when it comes into his intellect, is going to forge a certain type of intellect about how it's reasonable to get this money into the hand of the poor person differently than another person with a different intellect, all pre-verbal,
It's how
right?
we internalize things.
Okay, fine. Done. So this is the process that's explained in Tanya, of going all the way from basically the original rachamim in the soul, which is this pleasure of wanting to give mercy, all the way down to the sof maisa, which is you actually give the guy the pruta in his hand. And that's called na'ut sofa b'techilasa. That's called the end being wedged in the beginning. Sofan, right? The end being wedged in the beginning, the end, which is the sof maisa, nimsa kivar b'techilasa. It is already found in the very, very origin in the beginning. In other words, when I originally had this simple mercy that like ushered itself out of my soul, it already had inside of there in a hidden way the end of deed that I want to give this guy something. Oh, it's true, it had to go through a whole process of all those stages we just said, and you don't actually find a hand to give the tzedakah until the very end, but it's irrational to say that in my original mercy, I didn't already have all that worked out to some level, and you could say that the end was found in the beginning. In other words, the whole reason that my soul produced this original mercy is because I want to give this person $5. It's not, in other words, it's not like an independent, right? Yeah.
You could still have like mercy and everything pop up in your mind without you doing anything about it.
That's true. It doesn't have to get to the bottom of but it's in there. In other words, you got stopped along the way of this process somewhere because as every stage develops, if you're going to go from mercy into will, and from will into intellect into emotion, into thought, speech, and action, there's tzimtzum in every one of those places. And so there's potential, what is tzimtzum? It's judgment at every single one of those places, which says, well, maybe not. In other words, in order for it to come out, you have to sort of overcome all those challenges. The will say, maybe I have a will for something else. Okay, I'm so glad you have such infinite mercy, godly soul. But my animal soul wants to sit and watch Netflix. So the will to actually get from the mercy to the will of wanting it, already at the level of will, you could have a will which covers over the will of producing this. And then when you get to the intellect, fine, I have a will. But my brain is wired to sit and watch Netflix. So I'm going to find an intellectual position in my mind which does not allow that will to come to its next stage because some other intellect sort of shook it off its course. And so with the emotion, and so with the machshav, and so with the dibur. So you're absolutely right. Just because you have this original good idea in your soul does not necessitate that it's going to come out. But if it would come out, in other words, it's already in there. Something could stop it, but it already has like a whole flow chart of what it would look like if it actually did come out. And when it does come out, certainly you could say that it was already in there to begin with, because that was the intention to begin with, is that you should actually give. Fine. The whole reason of the original surfacing of this mercy was so that it would come out and happen. Which is the actual drawing forth of goodness to the poor person in actual deed. And even though it says in the Gemara, now he says in the Gemara there's an interesting little principle. It says someone who gives a pruta to a poor person, pruta is a small coin, right? He gets blessed with 6 blessings. In the Gemara, they say what each blessing is and where they learn it from. But it says, "Hamafaiso." What is a mafais? It means to sort of comfort him, to make him feel good about himself. Gets blessed with 11 blessings. So in other words, that's why if someone asks you for money and you don't have any, you should definitely not just sort of push them off and be rude to them. You can get blessings just for making them feel good and saying like, sorry, I don't have, right? Like, I wish I could help you. But that's sort of one explanation of hamafaiso. The real, as the Rebbe is going to say, the real deeper explanation of hamafaiso is even when you give him the money, you don't give it to him with an angry face, right? And on the contrary, if you give it to him and you make him feel good about the fact that you gave it to him, then you get blessed not only with 6 blessings, but 11 blessings. It's basically this idea of going the extra mile and making him feel good about it. So he says that now, even though we said a person who gives gets 6, and a person who's mafayis gets 11, it doesn't mean that someone who's mafayis is considered more blessed than someone who gives. In other words, you could understand that the way I originally explained it, which is that I don't have any money, but I'll sort of make you feel good, right? In which case you might think that it's not necessary to get to the sof maisa, right? Because someone who basically just says, sir, I wanted to give you, but I can't feel good about it, that's almost even better, because it says you get 11 blessings. So he brings this little chazal here, maybe as an argument to what he just said, right? If sof maisa, the end deed, was the ultimate cause for everything, then seemingly you shouldn't get more blessings if you don't make it to the end deed. You follow? So what he says is, no, that's not what this chazal means. It means that you did get to the end deed, you got those 6 blessings, but you were also mafayis him, and therefore you got 5 more, right? Because basically you did the end deed with a flair. Not that you didn't make it to the end deed. And that's what he says. The kavanah is not that to placate him is more chashuv than actually giving him the money, right? So then, so then why do you get 11 blessings when you placate him? Because that's only when the placating is in addition to the actual giving. So you have to for sure get to the end deed. Now the question is, what is this extra blessing that when you get to the end deed and you do it with a gusto? We'll see in a second. Which means in addition to him actually giving the pruta, he also reveals some deeper levels of that process that we just discussed, right? Which was the will and the good feeling in his heart. In other words, if he gives the end of deed, right, and it's just merely a deed, then you only see at the end one contraction after the next contraction after the next contraction, and you only wind up finding at the end the most contracted part of this process, and you see none of the intermediary steps showing up in the end. But if you give the deed and you do it with a flair, with a gusto, and you are, what was the word I used before? I like that, mafayas, you're placating him with a good feeling, right? So then what you're seeing is you're getting to the end indeed, but you're also making a window where you can see some of the inner process of delight that caused you to give that in the first place. How did this all start? With this great pleasure of wanting to have mercy. There was a pleasure inside of your soul, and that pleasure was the cause of the will, which was the cause of the intellect, which was the cause of the emotions, thought, speech, and action. So when you give, and you give in a way of placating, you not only get to the level of action, but you sort of also reveal some of the inner dimensions of pleasure, and that's why you do it with a happy face on. You can't wait to run and give this person, because it's done where the sof maisa also shows on the original pleasure inside. Right? That's what it means. You get blessed with 11. You're revealing the original pleasure and delight in this thing. In other words, there's different ways of being mafayis somebody. You ever seen certain people give tzedakah, where if you see someone give tzedakah, mamash like a pro, he's showing the emotion and the intellect and the will and the pleasure all inside of that gift. Right? That's like mamash how you do it. Because the poor person feels totally elevated from the pleasure that he was able to give the giver, right? Or it could be that you didn't actually show all that, you just gave this tzedakah, you get 6 blessings, right? That's why how can you note the difference? Because the giving is done with a tremendous joy. Because you're giving it with joy, that's what makes the person so placated. He doesn't feel like a beggar anymore. He's like, oh, I just made this guy's day. Yeah.
So isn't the highest thing of tzedakah to give without him even knowing, though? Isn't that the highest part of tzedakah you can get to?
Okay, but we're not discussing that case obviously right now, because even so, the person could give to the kuppah with great joy or something.
Is it about you actually giving with the happiness, or
In
is it
this-
about you receiving?
No.
How you make the person feel that
Yeah,
they're receiving it.
yeah. In this case, we're not talking about that case, right? There's a transaction that goes on, and the person that receives the transaction is experiencing your love at the time of giving. The fact that there's different ways of doing tzedakah is a different conversation.
The question was more, is it more of the way that he's receiving it or the way that you're giving it?
The he's receiving it. It's not called pius and like placating unless he feels good about it, right?
You can't get those 11 blessings if you're giving it honestly.
If you're giving it what?
If you're giving it without them knowing, you can't get those.
Anonymously. Not necessarily. They might get extremely happier because they didn't have to be embarrassed at all. But in principle, what we're saying here is that there's some kind of a radiant joy that comes from the poor person who's in a state of receiving, as opposed to what could obviously be a very uncomfortable and embarrassing situation for that person. Fine. But the point we're trying to make here is that even though the giving is last indeed, this little chazal, which came to seemingly throw us off, seeming to say that you get more blessings for just placating him, no. You get the blessings for giving, period, and then you get even more blessings if the giving is done in such a way that it actually shows some of the inner process of pleasure that was actually responsible for that giving. She'inyan zeh poel romus ba'ani. This causes, it exalted this in the poor person, right, when you give in such a way. But all of this only comes about when there's actually a giving in the end. In other words, so it's true that you can send through that pipe all the way from the top. You can in the end giving, there can still be a presence of the original pleasure, right? But only when you give in the end. But what's the point? That's called na'ut sof metechilasan. That's called, right, having the end wedged in the beginning. Because even though the end is this contracted deed of just a final action compared to this deep inner power of your soul, the reality is you can see that the end is wedged in the beginning because it's possible to give him in such a way where all that pleasure is still juicy sitting there at the end. Because the end is nothing other than the pleasure of the beginning. Sometimes it gets lost in translation, but if you're able to do the mitzvah with the full gusto, then the original pleasure of your soul, of this Rahmanas, it actually is felt at the end of the process. That's called the end being wedged in the beginning. Can you see why? Right? Because the end is holding on to that original pleasure. In the very beginning of your arousal, you already have a placeholder for that end giving. So the original pleasure is flush inside of that final deed. If it can come out properly, it's already there. The same is true the other way around, from above to below. As we say, na'utz techilasan besofa. Not only is the end wedged in the beginning is wedged in the end. Right? The beginning is wedged in the end. Hainu shekasher mizbonim b'amshachas hachesed v'atov la'ani b'pol mamish besofa, which means when a person will meditate about the actual hamshach of the goodness to the poor person indeed, which is he's meditating about the end in the beginning. As I roim bezeh es techilasan, then you can already see the beginning in the end. In other words, that the cause of bringing this whole thing forward is because of the original arousal of the will and the pleasure to begin with. That he's going to have in this deed. If it would have been broken, this arousal of will, it never would have come out. Right, so you could see, let's try and look at that one more time. Let's read that whole thing again, if you don't mind. Timing?
It's 8:35.
It's 8:35, so maybe we'll read that whole thing tomorrow. All right, we'll come